I get a lot of questions about using a hand file versus an e-file and what is better for your nails, what's better for your natural nails versus acrylics, etc., etc. So we will be discussing the pros and cons of using a hand file versus using an e-file. And before we get into any of the technicals, I want to discuss some of the tools that we use for hand filing and e-filing. So the first thing we will be talking about is the 240 grit file. So this is what you would call a fine file. The grit number, which is 240, it's pretty high. And when you talk about grit in terms of hand files or any abrasives really, the higher you go, the finer the surface is, which is to say the higher you go, the smoother it is on the surface of the file or abrasive, and the lower you go, the more rough and more abrasive the file is. So you would typically use a 240 grit file to shape natural nails because of how fine it is. It won't be causing any damage to the like nail plate when you file it, because a rougher nail file can cause the edges to become more rough and eventually cause the nail to break. So when you use something that is of higher grit and smoother on the natural nail, it leaves a much smoother finish as well. So you don't have to go in and like buff it as much, etc. I also personally like to use this file to sometimes end filing. Like I usually file enhancements, which is to say fake nails, what one would call. Enhancements include like hard gel extensions or fills or overlays. When I refer to extensions, I am talking about anything that's what people typically call fake nails, and that includes any kind of extensions or overlays done with hard gels, acrylics, dip system, what have you. When I refer to natural nails, I mean your natural nails without any kind of product on top of it. So when I do enhancements, I usually like to use a file with a lower grit, which means that it's rougher, and I like shaping it with a file that's rougher because it takes off more product. But even when I do enhancements, I still like to finish it off with a 240 grit file because it gives a smoother finish. When I'm finishing off a set of enhancements, I also like to use a higher grit file to smooth off any of the edges or facets that remain on the artificial nail. Next up is the 180 grit file. So I feel like I end up using this the most because I do a lot of enhancements in salon. And this is, I would say, like a medium rough to rough. There are files out there that's like 100 grit, 80, etc., which are really rough, but this is, I feel like this gets the job done without being too abrasive. I personally like using the 180 grit nail file for smoothing down enhancements after the application of the hard gel or acrylics is done, because a lot of times when you're using a 100 or 80 grit file to kind of take down product or smooth it, you leave a lot of deep scratches which need to be smoothed down further with a 180 and then a 240, etc., in order to like completely get rid of the scratches and so that it doesn't show up when you apply the polish. And if you go in straight with the 180, you kind of eliminate that whole 3 other steps. So moving on to buffers. These are also a pretty integral part of the whole manicuring process. Whether you do natural nails or whether you're doing enhancements, buffers are pretty stable product that you will always have in your manicure kit. So the first one we'll talk about is the Flex buffer, which is a 220 to 280 grit buffer. It is a sponge buffer, which means that it kind of gives a little cushion when you're applying, kind of, gliding it over the surface of the nail. And what that basically means is that when you're kind of running it across the surface of the nail, it isn't hard as the regular files are, so it won't be taking off as much of the nail plate or whatever surface like of the enhancements, etc., as the regular files will, which are hard. So the cushion sort of takes away a little bit of the, in a sense, efficiency of the product, but that's exactly what we want for the purposes of the use of a buffer. So the 220 to 280 grit buffer is classified as a fine buffer, and usually it's used to smooth down, like kind of like the final smoothing after you're done with kind of filing and smoothing most of the enhancement like acrylics, hard gels. But then this buffer is also really good for taking off the shine from natural nails before doing a regular manicure or a gel manicure on natural nails. This is my favorite buffer to use for prepping natural nails. Another option when you want to use buffers is the 100 to 180 grit buffer. I would say when you kind of look for buffers, you tend to come across a 100 to 180 grit buffer more often than 220 to 280. Because it takes off more product than like the finer buffer does. But I will say it's much better to use on artificial nails than it is to use on natural nails. I would not really recommend 180 to 80 grit buffer to use on natural nail plate because it can possibly take off more of the surface than you really want to. So you kind of have to use it with a light hand and be a little bit more careful when using it on natural nails. That being said, the 100-180 grit buffer is pretty important for when you want to smooth down artificial nails. It's really great to smooth down acrylics or hard gel enhancements, overlays, what have you, because sometimes the really fine buffer isn't enough to take down some of the edges or scratches that you've left behind after smoothing down the nail with regular like a 180-100 grit file. Now that we're done discussing the hand files, we can move on to e-files. E-files typically come in two different types. One is a desktop, and that is what you would just plug in to your power supply, etc., and have it there in your table. Or you also have them available in the portable type, which come with a rechargeable battery, which is inserted into the control box of the e-file. And what we usually use to do the actual filing is called a handpiece, and that's what you would be holding in your hand like a pen with a bit inserted into it, and you can kind of go in and remove product, etc. So this is what a bit for e-file typically looks like. This is what we would call a carbide bit. This is a safety carbide bit, and this is a diamond bit. They come in many other different styles as well, and all the different bits and different shapes of bits are used for different purposes. So the carbide bit is what you would typically see the most in the market. This is great for using on nail enhancements, but you would never ever use that on natural nails. A diamond bit is something that you would use less for taking down product and more for smoothing purposes. And there are a lot of fine diamond bits out there that can be used for manicuring natural nails and getting rid of cuticles. In my personal experience, e-files are absolutely necessary when providing professional services. It is okay to be doing services with just a hand file, and there are a lot of nail techs out there who prefer to use a hand file over e-file, but in my personal experience, it has greatly reduced the service time as well as opened up a lot of other options for me. For example, I felt that when I started using e-file, I was much better able to take off the lifted parts when doing a fill than I was able to do with a hand file. Because you can get bits that are so small in size, you can actually go in and carve out a piece of, acrylic or enhancement that's lifted in the middle of the nail, as opposed to kind of filing it all down or having to take it all off. I found that when I was trying to take off lifting with hand file, I ended up doing more damage with the hand file because of how rigid it is than when I tried using e-files. Another very important aspect of switching over to e-files would be to avoid carpal tunnel syndrome, which is very common within a nail techs. So anyone who's offering enhancement services will notice that after a while, with the constant movement of filing, you start to see symptoms of carpal tunnel. And not to say that that's the main reason, but it does contribute to issues. So if you switch over to e-files, I feel like it takes a lot of stress off of filing, and you don't feel the immediate physical strain as much as you would when hand filing everything. Safety bits differ from regular bits in a way that they're kind of rounded at the top. So even if you get really close to the skin or the cuticle line, you won't be able to cut the client as easily. So if anyone's looking to dive into using e-files, I feel like this would be a very good choice for them to start out with. Even though I do bulk of the work on enhancements with the e-file, I always still use hand files to shape the nail, as well as to do the finishing smoothing of the nail surface. Even though I use the e-file a lot more than I use hand files these days because of how efficient it is as taking off bulk of the product when doing enhancements, there are certain things that only hand files can do because of the amount of control they lend to your service. I personally prefer using a hand file to do the shaping of the nails and also smoothing down the facets and edges that an e-file might have left after taking bulk of the product down. So I usually like to end every service for enhancements by filing the, kind of finishing off and making the edges a lot crisper with the hand file, as well as smoothing the top with the hand file, and then finishing it off with smoothing buffer. So even though it's daunting for a lot of beginners to start using an e-file because it seems like you're using a power tool on a person's hand, I would say go for it sooner rather than later, only because the more you use it, the more practiced you become and the easier it becomes. For me now, it feels like more of an extension of my own hand, but when I started, I too was pretty, it was like a learning curve too. There were a lot of people I worked with when I started out doing nails that were pretty reluctant to start using e-files, and they preferred to only use hand files, but they eventually all had to kind of start incorporating e-files into their service because they were losing out on a lot of time and money. I personally feel like it's a very indispensable tool in my kit, and once you get used to it, it can be your best friend. So having gone through the pros and cons of both hand filing and e-filing, I hope this encourages you to kind of delve into the world of e-filing, but also, keep your practice up with hand filing, as there's a place for both of them when doing services on clients and doing your own nails as well.